So, so as Paul indicated, I am going to be talking about the sort of technical background of cryptocurrencies. You were promised a spine-tingling tale, and so here is the beginning of it. This is actually, I believe, a true, although rather highly embellished by me, story about the first recorded commercial transaction involving cryptocurrency, which was 10,000 bitcoins paid for a pair of pizzas. And you can see some of the footnotes there. The value of that was somewhat different at the time. But anyhow, so this raises the question, of course, of exactly what is a cryptocurrency, which in some sense has a very simple answer. A cryptocurrency, of course, is a blockchain of transactions made in usually some private currency, so some currency that is generated and managed by some private entity rather than by some government. That, of course, isn't really an answer. It leaves the question of, well, what is a blockchain? A blockchain is really a cryptographically secured decentralized ledger. What could be simpler than to say that? But maybe to start making some sense of that, we need to talk a little bit about what cryptography looks like, particularly cryptography today. So the reference point for that is classical cryptography, which in the cryptography world basically means cryptography before 1976. Turns out everything in cryptography changed between 1976 and 1978. And before this change, the way that people would use cryptography would be, let's say Alice over here on the left has some message that she wants to securely send to Bob over on the right. And her message originates in a form that we call plain text, meaning that it is ordinary English or whatever language Alice and Bob speak, text that anybody who happens to see it can understand. To protect that text from people who Alice and Bob do not want to see it, Alice puts it through some kind of encryption process. As a mathematician, I would say that process is simply a function. In practical implementation, it might be a machine that she can type the plain text into. It might be some process that she carries out by hand. But in any case, in addition to the plain text, the encryption depends on some information called a key, which sort of tailors precisely how characters of plain text are translated into characters of encrypted text, or what's called ciphertext. And the ciphertext will look to anybody who happens across it like just total gibberish. They will not be able to see any meaning in that. When Bob receives the ciphertext, which is sent to him over radio or telephone or a carrier pigeon or whatever mechanism they wish, Bob puts the ciphertext into a decryption function, which is kind of a complement to the encryption. And again, that could be a machine, it could be some process Bob carries out by hand. But however it's done, Bob needs to know what key Alice used to encrypt her message in order to sort of provide the appropriate transformations of the ciphertext into intelligible plain text. And one of the crucial features of this system is that Alice and Bob both need to share the same key. So they need to have this piece of common information that they will use to encrypt and decrypt. And that turns out to be actually a significant weakness of these sorts of crypto systems, because it means that that key on the one hand has to be kept deeply secret, but on the other hand, there's kind of this old saying that a secret shared by two or more people is not really a secret anymore. So classical cryptography was subject to threats where spies or eavesdroppers would try to steal keys one way or another. And then, as I said, between 1976 and 1978, everything changed because mathematicians invented something called public key cryptography. And the idea of public key cryptography is that instead of having one key that the two parties need to share, everybody has two keys. You can think of one of them, the ones that I've indicated as E's, are keys used to encrypt messages. And the ones indicated by D's are keys used to decrypt messages. Although, as I'll show in a minute, it doesn't really matter which one you use for which purpose. The crucial thing is that these two keys are kind of inverses of each other. Each one undoes the effect of the other. And so we no longer really need to talk about encryption versus decryption as separate things. They're just functions. And being a mathematician, I know that functions are always called F. So we have a function that if it is given a piece of plain text and say Alice's D key, will transform it into some form which can then be undone by Alice's E key. And if Alice wants to process the plain text first with her E key, that would be undone by her D key. So the crucial thing about this relationship between the E and the D keys is that Alice can now take her E key, say, and she can make it public. She can put it on her Facebook page, or this being the 1970s, she can put it in the telephone book. She can scrawl it on walls someplace. She can let the whole world know what the E is, as long as she doesn't tell anybody what the D key is. So if she keeps the D key completely secret, anybody who wants to send her a message can encrypt it using this public E key, and she can decrypt it with the D, and she's the only person who knows that D. There's no longer two people who have to know the D key. And of course, similarly, Bob and anybody else who wants to use public key cryptography does the same thing. The trick to making this work, of course, is to find ways of having these E and D key pairs and preserve the property that everybody in the world knowing what the E, the encryption key is, does not give them any ability to guess what the D key is. That, I think, is why it took between 1976 and 1978 to make this real. The first paper that kind of speculated about what you could do if you had these pairs of keys was published in 1976. And in 1978, a sort of second paper was published. And the second paper was by people whose names happened to be Revest, Edelman, and Shamir, whose initials form the acronym RSA, which you may have heard in connection with public key cryptography. They published a paper where they basically said, hey, we think we found a way to actually make this happen. And that did, in fact, become the first highly successful public key crypto system. So let's see. So here again is just kind of a review of how public key cryptography can be used to send secure messages. So to allow Alice to send a message to Bob in a form that only Bob will be able to read. So Alice's plain text goes into this box F. She gives it Bob's encryption key, the one that he has written on the walls and put in the telephone book and on his Facebook page and so forth. That produces ciphertext, so gibberish that nobody can understand, until Bob puts that ciphertext and his secret or decryption key into the same function. And then, because the decryption key reverses the effect of the encryption key, the plain text comes back out for Bob to read. So that's the sort of the essence of how public key crypto systems allow security. They do another very cool thing, though, which is they also provide a form of signature. So let's suppose that Alice wants to send some message to Bob, and she's not so concerned that it be secret from everybody else. Instead, she's concerned that Bob can rely on it actually having come from her. So she wants to send Bob a message that says something like, hey, Bob, this is Alice. I'll give you 10,000 Bitcoins if you can just get me 2 pizzas, let's say. And she wants Bob to rely on that really being a promise from her. So she wants to do the equivalent of signing that message. The way she can do that is she takes her message and she puts it through the encryptor using her decryption key, so using her secret key. And she's the only person who knows what that key is. So if, when Bob receives the resulting message, he can put Alice's public key, which of course he knows because everybody knows that key, into this function and get back an intelligible message, Bob can rely on the fact that Alice is the only person in the world who could have actually encrypted a message in such a way that it would successfully decrypt with her public key. And this is taken as a way of Alice proving that she actually originated a message, basically the purpose that signatures have been used for historically. So that's the idea of a digital signature. There is one sort of wrinkle to that, though, which is that even though I described this process as proving that Alice originated the message, all that it really proves is that a person who knows the secret key that corresponds to a particular public one originated the message. And that person might not be Alice. That might be some shadowy figure just claiming to be Alice. Or it might even be some shadowy figure just admitting to be a shadowy figure. Somebody who simply said, hey, you don't know who I am, but if you ever want to communicate with me, here is my public key. So somewhat paradoxically, even though digital signatures are taken as a way of kind of proving identity, they really do much less than that. They really just sort of prove an association between a message's originator and a particular private key. If you choose to keep the actual identity of the person behind that private key secret, digital signatures in some sense become a way of providing a certain amount of anonymity, because you can still sort of prove the origin of a message without proving the actual person or entity behind that source. So okay, so that's the sort of security and authentication aspects of public key cryptography. There's one more aspect of it that will play a big role in cryptocurrencies and blockchains, and that's the idea of what's called a hash. And the idea there is that a cryptographic hash is a small document or small code that somehow represents what are typically much larger documents, and does so in a way without revealing anything about the contents of those documents. And I think there's sort of two common uses of hashes. One is simply sort of efficiency to save disk sort of computer storage and communication bandwidth. So I don't know, let's suppose Alice and Bob have both downloaded the complete works of human literature from the internet or something, some massive document, and they're curious as to whether they both got the same version of it. So rather than one of them sending this massive document to the other one, what they could do is they could each compute a hash of their document and then exchange the hashes and compare them. And if they have the same hash, then with very, very high probability, they have the same original document, because two different documents are not supposed to produce the same hash. And if the hashes are different, then they have different versions of the document. Another use of hashes is to preserve privacy, because the value of a hash doesn't tell you anything about the contents of the original document. So if Alice and Bob, for example, maybe they're both doctors or medical practices, and for some reason they start to think that there's a group of patients that are coming to both of them, and they would like to know if this is true. They want to avoid double prescribing medications, things like that. But they don't necessarily want to reveal who those people are, for privacy reasons, maybe for competitive advantage reasons. So they can check whether they are in fact dealing with the same pool of people if each of them makes a list of who those people are, computes a hash of it, and then they compare the hashes. So all they have to share are these codes that don't actually reveal what information produced the code, but that can be relied on to be the same if it was the same information, and different if it was different information. And so as I said, hashes are widely used in what's coming up. So I think that's kind of the last thing that you need to know about modern cryptography. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, I think the definition of blockchain that I mentioned a few minutes ago is that it's a cryptographically secured, decentralized ledger. Each of those means specific things. The fact that it is cryptographically secured means that cryptographic methods, in particular hashes, are used to make sure that once something is put into this ledger, it can't be altered or deleted afterwards. Decentralized means that there is no sort of central authority controlling the ledger, that it's just sort of the users collectively who are in charge of what goes into the ledger, and sort of what it means. And then ledger means very much what it means in sort of common usage. It's a record of some series of transactions or events, which might be things like sort of monetary transactions, payments or payments or debits, or it might be records of things like property ownership. It might be a series of legal contracts. Typically it's things of some kind of sort of economic or legal significance. So there's a little bit more about what a blockchain is. It turns out that blockchain was first introduced in connection with the Bitcoin cryptocurrency. So to a certain extent, I think the two are still seen as kind of similar, although blockchains are coming to be used more and more for a lot of things besides cryptocurrencies. They're being seen as a very valuable tool anytime somebody wants a sort of computer-based, reliable, secure record of important transaction information. So anyhow, so here's kind of a high-level view of what a blockchain is. As the name suggests, it is a series of blocks of data. The blocks are kind of linked together in historical order. So the kind of the first block in the chain contains the most recent information. It gives you access to the second block, which contains slightly older information and gives you access to a third block, and so forth. I will sort of generically call the things in a block transactions. So the first block in this chain contains maybe transaction 1.1, transaction 1.2, some number of transactions. The second block contains some number of slightly older transactions, not necessarily the same number. But so at a high level, a blockchain is just this list of groups of transactions. And of course, if it were done like that, it would not be terribly secure. So one of the keys to how blockchains are made secure, and in particular, how they're made resistant to tampering or modification of information once it goes into the chain, is that inside each block, in addition to the transactions associated with that block, there's a hash of the previous block. So a hash of the block that this one then links to. And what that means is that if anybody went and changed that previous block, the change would be instantly detectable, because all you would have to do is compute a hash of that second block and notice that the hash doesn't agree with the one that's stored in the first block. And so that is that's probably sort of the root of the sort of so-called non-repudiation property of blockchains, the inability to change or undo information after it's been put into the chain. And again, this relies very much on the fact that cryptographic hashes are very sensitive to even small changes in information, and that they don't give you information about the actual contents of that previous block. So yeah, so that's sort of the interior structure of a block. Now, there is a potential problem with blockchains, which arises from their being decentralized. So the fact that there's no central authority responsible in particular for adding blocks to the chain. Rather, the blocks get added to this chain simply as more transactions arrive to be recorded, and the users of the chain become aware of those transactions and want to add them. And so what can happen is you can have a situation where two users both notice some set of transactions that need to be added to the chain. They both go and build a new block, but they don't have quite the same set of transactions. And so you end up with two different potential heads for the blockchain. And that's a situation called a fork. And that, of course, is a bad thing, because the whole structure of the blockchain, and in particular, the idea that you can sort of protect it from tampering by having each block contain a hash of the block before it, suddenly goes out the window if you get kind of a branching structure like this, and there may be multiple heads, multiple versions of what a particular block somewhere in the chain should be. So the possibility of forking a blockchain is something that has to be sort of very carefully controlled, or there have to be mechanisms for avoiding it. And the mechanism that is used, at least the one that's used in Bitcoin, so the one that was sort of proposed as the first consistency control mechanism for blockchain, relies on two properties. The first one is that blocks are actually very expensive to create. And it takes a long time to create a block, which means that they're not going to be created all that often. So there are not all that many opportunities for a fork to occur in the first place. And then the second component is a rule for resolving forks if and when users of the blockchain notice them. And that rule is roughly that if you see a fork, if you see two heads to the blockchain, roughly the longest one wins. So in a situation like I've sketched here, where a fork has occurred, and on one side of it, 2 blocks have been added to the chain, but on the other side, only 1 block has been added, the rule says that the fork with the 2 blocks is the authoritative one, and the one with 1 block on it just gets thrown away. And so poor whoever it was who had transaction 1.2b basically just loses. Their transaction disappears. And this is something that I'll come back to a little bit in connection with Bitcoin per se. So this is sort of the rule for resolving inconsistencies. And I think the other thing to say a little bit about in connection with blockchain is to sort of look at the security implications of it. I mentioned the fact that each block has a hash of the previous block in it, which is a way of detecting tampering. Now, there is, of course, a way around that, which is that if some attacker wants to, say, change a block somewhere down in a blockchain, they could go ahead and do that. They could make that change. But in order to get away with it, they would then have to change the next block towards the head in order to give it the right hash, in order to give it a hash of their modified block. And then as soon as they change the hash of that next block, they have to change the hash of the block before it also. So they have to kind of work their way from the point at which they made the change all the way through to the head of the blockchain, changing every single block as they go. And the protection against this is mainly that idea that changing blocks takes a long time. So making a new block is slow. So it's going to take this attacker a long time to modify all the blocks. And while they're doing that, the rest of the blockchain community, so all of the other users, are presumably adding legitimate new heads to the chain. So new transactions are coming in, they're getting put into blocks, they're getting put at the head of the chain. And so this poor attacker has to kind of scramble to catch up. And as long as he doesn't have a whole lot of computing resources compared to what's available to sort of the whole community of users, the chances are that the legitimate users are going to run ahead of the attacker and keep adding more and more and more blocks to the front of the chain. And the attacker is actually going to fall further and further behind in terms of where they need to be in order to change everything. So that's I think, an important part of blockchain security, but it does rely on sort of the majority of the community using a blockchain to be honest players, rather than people trying to subvert the blockchain. Okay, so that is blockchain. And so now we could talk about cryptocurrency a little bit. The main cryptocurrency I'm going to talk about is Bitcoin. First of all, because it is the original and oldest cryptocurrency. And second of all, because most others seem to be sort of variations on the basic ideas pioneered by Bitcoin. So let's see. So this very busy picture here is kind of the Bitcoin universe. And there are sort of 2 main roles in that universe. There are people who own Bitcoins. So people like Alice or Bob who own Bitcoins, want to be able to spend them to buy things, want to receive them as payment for things. And then there are so-called miners. And the miners, the metaphor is gold miners, of course. The miners are the people who actually control the blockchain. They're the people who add new blocks to a blockchain. And yes, having said the blockchain, I should say a little bit about which blockchain that is. So in particular, it's a blockchain that simply records all of the Bitcoin transactions that have ever been done. So it is by now a very large, very long blockchain. And as I said, it's in the hands of these miners. So the way sort of the Bitcoin world evolves is when a coin owner, say Alice down here, wants to say to make a purchase, she generates a transaction request. So she generates a request that says, "Hey, I would like to use 10,000 Bitcoins to buy these 2 pizzas, please." And she actually identifies that request with what's called her Bitcoin address. The address is basically, it's a signed public key. So it's a public key that allows people to communicate with Alice, and it's signed with a private key of Alice's so that people can verify that it really does come from her. So you have a way of sort of proving who it is who's asking to spend these Bitcoins. Alice takes that transaction and she sends it to one or more of the miners. Doesn't necessarily have to send it to all of them. She just sends it to a couple. The miners who receive it add it into a set of transactions that they're going to put in a new block on the blockchain. When they've got enough transactions, they create a block. And again, block creation is slow and expensive, so this doesn't happen all that often. While they are waiting, they're supposed to broadcast Alice's transaction to all the other miners so that other miners can be including it in the blocks that they might be creating also. And then eventually one of these miners has enough transactions to make a new block, add it to the blockchain. And in doing so, they actually get paid a little bit. They get paid in the form of a new Bitcoin or a new fraction of a Bitcoin. So they have kind of an incentive to maintain the blockchain, and the overall supply of Bitcoin increases slowly over time. Let's see, once a miner has added a block to the blockchain, they again broadcast that new blockchain to all the other miners. So every miner actually has their own copy of the blockchain. And in addition to adding new blocks to it, they can check new blocks that have been added to make sure that those blocks are consistent with what they had before, to make sure that they don't see a fork forming in the chain and things like that. So that is sort of the essence of the Bitcoin sort of high universe, as I said, kind of from a high level view. At a slightly lower level view, there are those transactions that Alice and Bob are participating in. And they are actually surprisingly complicated things, as you might be able to see from this diagram here. In particular, what a transaction is it's basically something that sort of gathers together certain sources of Bitcoin called inputs, and redirects them to I guess sort of users or recipients called outputs. So if say this is a transaction produced by Alice, this is in effect Alice saying, I want to take 1 Bitcoin from that payment that I got yesterday, and 2 Bitcoins from last week's salary, and maybe 1 more Bitcoin from some other source. And that gives me a total of 6 Bitcoins, of which I would like to send 4 of them to Bob. And one thing that's actually very common is to say, and I would like to send the other 2 to myself. Because there's actually a rule that says that a transaction has to spend as outputs all of the Bitcoins that it takes in. And in fact, if it doesn't do that, any miner who adds the transaction to a block gets to keep the difference as a so-called transaction fee. So if Alice has gathered 6 Bitcoins together in her transaction, but only needs 4 of them for Bob, she's very well advised to send the others back to herself rather than let some miner keep them. So that's kind of the idea of the arrows in the transaction. Another thing that is kind of clever about Bitcoin is that each one of the outputs of a transaction is associated with a little fragment of sort of called a script. Basically, think of it as a little fragment of a program that gets run whenever somebody tries to spend that output. And the idea is that the script can be almost anything that Alice wants to sort of check that the person or thing trying to spend this output is actually authorized to do so. And probably the most common script basically asks, basically checks a digital signature. So if Alice wants to send Bitcoin to Bob, she will attach to that a script that requires a signature from Bob that she can check to make sure that Bob is really the one trying to spend that money. The data going into the scripts are attached to the inputs of a transaction. So in this world where scripts are basically checking signatures, if the way Alice would set up this transaction is she would attach to each input what is actually a copy of most of the transaction data signed with her private key, and the corresponding script on the output would try to decrypt that with her public key. So basically the information that is in her Bitcoin address, because that's her public key. And if that decryption produces a valid description of a transaction that is in fact referring to this particular output, then the script allows the transaction to proceed. Otherwise, the script blocks it. So these scripts give Bitcoin the ability to do a little bit of kind of give it a little bit of flexibility in terms of sort of how Bitcoin are spent, under what circumstances transactions are allowed to proceed, things like that. Okay, I think the sort of the last thing, believe it or not, to say about Bitcoin is how it makes blocks hard to create, because that's a very important part of the underlying blockchain. And in Bitcoin, the trick is that each block of the blockchain is actually a little bit more sophisticated than what I showed earlier. So it still has a list of transactions in it. It still has a hash of the previous block, but it also has something called a nonce. And in this case, the term nonce simply means a block of data that the miner who created this block can set to any value they like, as long as the resulting hash is a numeric code less than a certain so-called target limit. And here again, sort of the properties of hashes, and in particular, sort of their unpredictability, become important, because there's no way that a miner can just kind of sit down and do some quick calculation and say, okay, so I need the hash of this block to be less than, say, 17. And I'm sure it's not really 17 in practice. It's probably more like a number that has, a couple of hundred digits in it. But there's no way that a miner can say, I need this block to hash to less than 17. And so therefore, I know 12 would be a good nonce. The only practical way that they can find a nonce is to just check each possibility in turn. So it's essentially, let's see, can I use 1 as a nonce? Oops, nope, doesn't work. How about 2? Nope, doesn't work. How about 3? Nope, doesn't work. And so to find a nonce that actually works is kind of set so that it takes, so that I guess I have, and I'm not sure what the realistic numbers are, but it's probably on the order of a number that you would write as a 1 with maybe 10 or 20 or 30 zeros after it. It's a number that ordinary people would think is a very, very large number. Cryptographers would actually think it's a very small number. But it's a large enough number that even with powerful computers, it's going to take on the order of several minutes to find a workable nonce. And in fact, part of the sort of Bitcoin system software is set up so that the target value that you're trying to get a hash to fall under by finding the right nonce. That target value is set, and it actually changes with time, so that the average rate of new blocks being added to the blockchain is about one every 10 minutes. And the way this part of the sort of the Bitcoin protocol works is that if over, I think it's over about a 2-week window, if over the last 2 weeks blocks have been created at a rate of more than 1 every 10 minutes, then that target value is set lower to make it harder to find a workable nonce. And if the rate of new blocks has fallen to less than 1 block every 10 minutes, the target value can be raised a little bit to make it easier to find nonces. So that's the mechanism that Bitcoin uses to make blocks hard to create. And that is, by and large, that is now sort of the technical foundations for Bitcoin. I want to point out some sort of technical problems that this raises, because I think there are actually quite a few of them. One of them is that the sort of the correctness of this whole system is basically a matter of kind of statistical probabilities. It's not something that's guaranteed. So in particular, Bitcoin and other similar blockchains work correctly because there probably won't be a fork. And if there is a fork, you probably won't lose your transaction in resolving it. And in fairness, once transactions get into a block that is a couple of blocks past the head of a blockchain or the Bitcoin blockchain, those probabilities are pretty close to certainties. But there is a period at least where there's sort of a probable correctness, not a guaranteed. Bitcoin and blockchains based on Bitcoins rely in a lot of ways on the miners playing by the rules. So the miners are responsible for sharing transactions that they learn of with other miners. They're responsible for sharing blocks that they've added to the blockchain with other miners. That raises in particular something called the 51% attack, which basically points out that if the majority of the computing power in the Bitcoin system or in a blockchain, similar blockchain system, gets together to try to break the system, that pool can in fact hijack the blockchain. If you remember when I talked about blockchain resistance to attack, a lot of that resistance relied on the fact that an attacker who changes a block then has to change the hashes and all the subsequent, or all the blocks between there and the head. and that while the attacker is trying to do that, all of these other block creators are adding further blocks to the head. But that argument really only works if the attacker doesn't have enough computing power to build new blocks quickly and change the blocks in the chain and eventually catch up to the people who are adding heads to the chain. And the way Bitcoin works, your ability to add blocks to the chain basically depends solely on how big and fast your computers are. And so if you happen to control at least half the computing power in the Bitcoin universe, or if you can get at least half the power in the Bitcoin universe to help you out, you can actually go change blocks and kind of take over the blockchain. And this actually is something that people are starting to worry about, because one of the things that's happening as, first of all, both as Bitcoin becomes more valuable and as that target value for adding new block, that target value for the nonce, and as you add new blocks to the chain becomes lower, is people are getting together in what are called mining pools, where basically a group of miners will sort of share all their computers together to create new blocks faster. And as those pools become bigger, the chances that one of them will actually control more than half of the computing power increases. So that's something that people are worried about. And then finally, sort of the whole design of Bitcoin, in some sense, is really not very scalable. The idea that it deliberately slows down block creation means that things like comparisons between, say, Bitcoin and credit card networks are sort of laughable. Bitcoin can process, I can't remember what it is. I think it's a couple of hundred transactions per minute, maybe a couple of thousand. A typical credit card network processes hundreds of thousands every minute. So there are big scalability problems with Bitcoin also. Let's see, I've been talking mostly about Bitcoin here. I should acknowledge that there are other forms of cryptocurrency out there. Two that are, I think, sort of significant. One is this cryptocurrency called Ethereum, which is certainly gets a certain amount of press. They draw a lot of attention to themselves. And one of the things that distinguishes Ethereum from Bitcoin is the scripting that's associated with sort of transfers of coin between one party and another. Ethereum has a much more powerful scripting language, which allows them to sort of sell themselves as a way of doing what they call smart contracts, so that you can actually write scripts that enforce kind of arbitrarily complicated contracts between two parties. So in addition, whereas Bitcoin, you typically say things like, I will pay this amount of Bitcoin, or I will transfer this amount of Bitcoin to somebody else, as long as they can prove with their signature that they are in fact Bob. Ethereum, you can in principle write complicated contracts. I will transfer this money to Bob only if there is someplace else a record that Bob has delivered the 1 pound of cement to my uncle, and the 3 pizzas have been transferred to so and so. And another variation on the Bitcoin idea is, I mentioned a few minutes ago that Bitcoin relies on just raw computing power to sort of be able to extend the blockchain. There's also an idea called proof of stake, which basically correlates the ability to extend the blockchain with kind of ownership of the currency rather than with computing power. It's not clear to me that that's an improvement, but at least it's a different way of sort of determining who controls the blockchain, or whose blocks are most likely to be added to it. And with that, I think I am pretty much done. Just kind of a sort of a summary of what's going on here. The cryptography that I started with is sort of a key ingredient in blockchain, in particular in providing the non-repudiation property via hashes, and then via signatures. That's also a key way of kind of authenticating cryptocurrency transactions. Blockchain is then the sort of the building block for the ledger on which cryptocurrencies rest. And then the last thing, just a couple of credits. Thank God for Wikimedia Commons. They have the artists who put things there are far better than I am at creating the various cartoons that I used. So with that, I will stop and see if there are any questions.